I always thought my brother Jake was just the typical jealous sibling. You know, the kind who'd steal your Halloween candy or accidentally break your favorite toy when we were kids. But standing there in my wedding dress, watching him pour gasoline all over my fiancé Michael, I realized I'd been living with a monster my entire life. Growing up, Jake was always the golden child in our family's eyes. 2 years older than me, he had this charming smile that could get him out of any trouble. When he got suspended for fighting in high school, Mom said he was just passionate. When he crashed Dad's car at 17, it was because he was learning responsibility. But when I brought home straight A's or won the science fair, it was just expected. Sarah always did well in school. That's just Sarah. The pattern started early. When I was 12 and finally worked up the courage to invite Tommy Chin to my birthday party, Jake told him I had lice. When I was 16 and dating Mark Williams, the quarterback everyone had a crush on, Jake showed him fake photos he'd photoshopped of me with other guys, claiming I was cheating. Each time I'd confront Jake and he'd give me that innocent smile and say, "I was just looking out for you, sis. These guys weren't good enough anyway." Our parents never saw it. To them, Jake was protective. Maybe a little overenthusiastic, but his heart was in the right place. They'd pat his shoulder and tell me how lucky I was to have a brother who cared so much. I learned to keep my relationships quiet, to hide the guys I liked, to build walls around the parts of my life that mattered most to me. College was my escape. At Northwestern, Jake couldn't sabotage my friendships or scare away potential boyfriends. For 4 years, I tasted freedom. I dated without fear, made friends without worrying about Jake poisoning them against me, and discovered who I was when I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder. I thought maybe he'd grown up. Maybe he'd found his own life and moved on from his weird obsession with controlling mine. I was wrong. When I graduated with my MBA and landed a position at a consulting firm in Chicago, Jake had somehow convinced our parents that I needed him to help me transition to the real world. Suddenly, he was my self-appointed roommate, showing up at my apartment with boxes and that same charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble our whole lives. Within a week, he'd scared off the guy I'd been casually seeing by showing up at our dinner date and making thinly veiled threats about treating his sister right. That's when I met Michael. Michael Richardson was everything Jake wasn't. Where Jake was impulsive and chaotic, Michael was thoughtful and stable. Where Jake made his living through a series of questionable get-rich-quick schemes, Michael had built a successful software company from the ground up. He was kind, genuinely funny, and treated me like I was the most important person in the world. For the first time in my life, I felt protected instead of constantly protecting myself. Michael was also successful in a way that Jake had always desperately wanted to be. While Jake bounced from one failed business venture to another, constantly asking our parents for loans he'd never repay, Michael drove a Tesla, owned a beautiful condo downtown, and talked about expanding his business internationally. The contrast was stark, and I could see it eating Jake alive. The first time I brought Michael home for dinner, Jake spent the entire evening making snide comments about trust fund babies and guys who've never had to work for anything. Michael handled it with grace, even attempting to engage Jake in conversation about his latest entrepreneurial venture, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hand tightened around his water glass. After dinner, as we were leaving, Jake pulled me aside. "He's not right for you, Sarah," he said, his voice low and serious. "Guys like that, they think they can buy whatever they want. You're just another acquisition to him." I laughed it off then, told him he was being ridiculous, but something in his eyes made my stomach clench. There was a darkness there I'd never seen before, something that went beyond simple sibling rivalry. The harassment started small. Michael would mention weird calls to his office, hang-ups that happened multiple times a day. His car got keyed in the parking garage of his building. Someone left a dead rat on his doorstep. When we tried to go out to dinner, we'd sometimes find his tires slashed. Michael was frustrated but assumed it was random city crime. I knew better. I confronted Jake after the tire incident. He was in our parents' basement, supposedly working on his latest business plan, which seemed to involve selling some kind of energy drink that would revolutionize the fitness industry. "Leave Michael alone," I said without preamble. Jake looked up from his laptop with that innocent expression I'd grown to hate. What are you talking about, sis? The phone calls, the vandalism. I know it's you. He leaned back in his chair, and for just a moment, the mask slipped. I saw something cold and calculating in his expression before the charming smile returned. You're being paranoid, Sarah. Maybe your boyfriend has enemies. Successful guys like that always do. The way he said successful made my skin crawl. Things escalated after Michael proposed. It was perfect. A sunset dinner on the roof of the signature room overlooking the city we both loved. The ring was stunning, and when he got down on one knee and told me he wanted to spend the rest of his life making me happy, I forgot about Jake, forgot about all the drama and fear. For those few minutes, it was just Michael and me and the promise of a future together. I should have known Jake wouldn't let it be that simple. The engagement party was supposed to be a small affair at our parents' house. Michael's family drove in from Cincinnati, and I'd invited a few close friends from work and college. It should have been perfect. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. Jake showed up drunk, which wasn't unusual, but there was something different about him that night. He was agitated, pacing around the backyard like a caged animal. When Michael's father started telling stories about Michael's childhood, Jake kept interrupting with comments about how some people just have everything handed to them. The breaking point came when Michael's mother complimented my ring. It's absolutely gorgeous, dear. Michael has such wonderful taste. Jake snorted. Yeah, well, when you can afford to spend more on a ring than most people make in a year, it's easy to have good taste. The party went quiet. Michael stood up slowly, his face flushed. Is there a problem, Jake? No problem, Jake said, but his voice was slurred and angry. Just interesting how some guys think they can buy their way into a family. Jake? Our father's voice was warning, but Jake was past caring. She was fine before you came along, he continued, pointing at Michael with his beer bottle. Sarah had a good life, a simple life. Now suddenly she thinks she needs all this fancy stuff, this perfect rich guy with his perfect car and his perfect apartment. I stood up, my face burning with embarrassment. Jake, stop. You're drunk. I'm not drunk. I'm honest. He whirled on me, and for a second I actually flinched. He's going to hurt you, Sarah. Guys like him always do. They use girls like you up and throw them away when something better comes along. Michael stepped between us, his voice calm but firm. I think you need to step away from Sarah. Or what? Jake's eyes were wild now, dangerous. You'll call your lawyers? Sue me? That's how your type handles problems, right? Jake, that's enough. Our mother was crying now, and I could see Michael's parents exchanging worried glances. This wasn't sibling rivalry anymore. This was something much darker. The party ended early, with Jake being escorted upstairs by our father while our mother apologized profusely to Michael's family. As we drove home, Michael was quiet, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I'm sorry, I said finally. He's not usually this bad. Michael glanced at me, and I could see something new in his expression. Not just frustration, but genuine concern. Sarah, that wasn't normal sibling behavior. The way he looked at you, at me. I think we need to be careful. I wanted to argue, to defend my family the way I always had, but deep down, I knew he was right. Jake wasn't just jealous anymore. He was dangerous. The incidents escalated after that night. Michael's office building received bomb threats. Someone broke into his condo and destroyed family photos, leaving everything else untouched. A dead cat was left in his car. Each time, the police took reports, but there was never enough evidence to prove Jake was responsible. Then came the wedding planning, and Jake's behavior became impossible to ignore. Every vendor I contacted seemed to have received mysterious calls warning them that the bride was unstable and the groom was involved with dangerous people. My dress appointment was canceled because someone had called claiming to be my mother, saying I'd been hospitalized. The florist received a call that the wedding was off. The photographer got a message that we were postponing indefinitely. Each time I'd have to call back, explain there had been a mistake, reschedule. Some vendors were understanding. Others decided they didn't want the drama and canceled our contracts entirely. Planning what should have been the happiest day of my life became a constant battle against sabotage. Michael wanted to hire security, maybe postpone the wedding until we could get a restraining order against Jake. But how could I explain to a judge that my brother was terrorizing us? He'd never actually threatened us directly, never left evidence. It was all just strange coincidences and bad luck, at least on paper. The worst part was how Jake acted around our family. Around our parents, he was still the same charming, slightly irresponsible younger son they'd always known. He'd make jokes about being protective, about how no guy would ever be good enough for his little sister. Our parents thought it was sweet. They couldn't see the way his eyes went dead when he looked at Michael, or how his jaw tightened whenever someone mentioned the wedding. 2 weeks before the ceremony, Michael found Jake sitting in his car outside his office building at 11 p.m. When Michael confronted him, Jake claimed he was just thinking about things and wanted to talk. The conversation, according to Michael, consisted mostly of Jake rambling about how Michael didn't understand our family, how he was going to ruin my life, how some people didn't deserve to be happy. He kept talking about fire. Michael told me that night as we lay in bed, me curled against his chest, both of us too wired to sleep. How fire purifies things, how it burns away what doesn't belong. Sarah, I think he's having some kind of breakdown. I wanted to disagree, but I couldn't. The brother I'd grown up with, the one who'd teased me and stolen my toys and scared away my boyfriends, was gone. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone whose hatred felt like a living thing growing stronger every day. The night before the wedding, Jake called me at 2 a.m. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up the phone. Sarah? His voice was strange, hollow. Jake? What's wrong? I just wanted to say I'm sorry, for everything, for being a bad brother. Relief flooded through me. Maybe he'd finally come to his senses. Maybe tomorrow could actually be perfect after all. It's okay, I said. We can work through this. We're family. There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, colder. Yeah, we're family. That's why I have to protect you, even if you hate me for it. The line went dead. I should have called the police then, should have canceled the wedding, should have grabbed Michael and run as far away as we could get. Instead, I told myself he was just drunk, just emotional, just scared of losing his little sister. I'd been making excuses for Jake my whole life. I couldn't stop, even when every instinct I had was screaming that something terrible was about to happen. The morning of my wedding dawned bright and beautiful. October in Chicago, crisp air and golden leaves, the kind of day that feels like a promise. I woke up in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by my bridesmaids, everyone chattering excitedly about hair and makeup and last-minute details. For a few hours, I forgot about Jake and his midnight call and the months of sabotage and harassment. This was my day. This was supposed to be perfect. The ceremony was set for 4 o'clock at the Four Seasons, overlooking the lake. Michael and I had opted for a relatively small wedding, only about 60 guests, but we'd spared no expense on the details. Everything was elegant, sophisticated, exactly what we'd dreamed of. Jake was supposed to walk me down the aisle alongside our father. It was a compromise we'd reached after weeks of family drama, our parents insisting that Jake needed to be part of the ceremony despite everything that had happened. Michael wasn't happy about it, but he'd agreed because he knew how important family harmony was to me. At noon, as I was getting my hair done at the hotel salon, our mother called. "Honey, Jake isn't here yet," she said, her voice tight with worry. "He was supposed to pick up his tux this morning, but the rental place says he never showed up." My stomach dropped. "Have you tried calling him?" "Straight to voicemail. Your father drove by his apartment, but his car's not there." Part of me felt relief. If Jake didn't show up, he couldn't ruin anything, but there was something else, something that felt like dread settling in my chest. Maybe he's just running late," I said, trying to keep my voice light for my bridesmaids, who had stopped chattering and were watching me with concerned expressions. "Maybe," Mom said, but she didn't sound convinced. "I'm sure he'll turn up. You know how Jake is." Yeah, I knew exactly how Jake was. By 2 o'clock, there was still no sign of him. Our father was making calls, our mother was pacing, and my bridesmaids kept asking if everything was okay. I wanted to tell them no, everything was definitely not okay, that I'd been waiting my whole life for Jake to destroy something I loved, and today was probably going to be that day. Instead, I smiled and said everything was fine. The show must go on. At 3:30, I was in my dress, a stunning creation of silk and lace that had cost more than my first car. My makeup was perfect. My hair was perfect. Everything was exactly as I'd imagined it. Looking in the mirror, I finally felt like a bride instead of a woman going to battle. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "You look beautiful. Can't wait to marry you in 30 minutes. I smiled, feeling some of the tension leave my shoulders. Whatever Jake was planning, we'd deal with it. Michael and I were strong together. We could handle anything. At 3:45, as the wedding party was lining up for the processional, our father appeared at my elbow. His face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk." The bottom dropped out of my world. "What happened?" "Jake's here," he said quietly. "But something's wrong with him. He doesn't seem like himself." Through the doorway, I could see into the main reception area where our guests were taking their seats. Michael was at the altar with his groomsmen, looking nervous but happy. The string quartet was playing softly, and everything looked exactly like the fairy tale I'd imagined. And then I saw Jake. He was standing at the back of the room, still in street clothes, jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt. His hair was messy, and even from a distance, I could see that something was off about him. He was holding something in his hand, something that caught the light. "Dad, what is he holding?" Our father's face crumpled. "I don't know, sweetheart, but maybe we should wait just until—" "No." The word came out harder than I'd intended. "I'm not letting him ruin this. Not today." I started walking toward the main room, my dress rustling behind me, my bridesmaids calling my name. I had to fix this. I had to stop whatever Jake was planning before he destroyed the most important day of my life. But as I got closer, as I saw the wild look in his eyes and the way his hand was gripping what I now realized was a gas can, I understood that I was already too late. Jake had finally found the perfect way to make sure no one would ever be good enough for his little sister. He was going to kill them all. The investigation that followed revealed truths about Jake that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. Detective Maria Santos, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who'd seen enough domestic violence cases to spot the patterns, pulled me aside 3 days after the incident. "Sarah, we need to talk about your brother's mental health history," she said gently. We were sitting in a sterile conference room at the police station, the fluorescent lights making everything look harsh and unforgiving. "Did you know he'd been hospitalized twice for psychiatric evaluation?" I stared at her, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me. "That's impossible. I would have known." Detective Santos slid a file across the table. "First time was when he was 19, during his sophomore year at community college. Apparently, he became obsessed with a female classmate, started following her, leaving gifts at her dorm. When she got a restraining order, he threatened to burn down the building with everyone inside." My hands shook as I opened the file. There were medical records, police reports, documents that painted a picture of someone I'd never known existed. "My parents never told me any of this." "Second hospitalization was 3 years ago," she continued. "Your neighbor called 911 when she saw him in your parents' backyard at 3 a.m., dousing their shed with gasoline. When the officers arrived, he claimed he was purifying the space because evil influences were trying to corrupt his family." The room spun around me. 3 years ago, I'd been living in my apartment downtown, completely unaware that my brother was having a psychotic break in our parents' backyard. Why didn't anyone tell me? "According to the reports, your parents insisted it was just stress from his business failures. They agreed to outpatient therapy in exchange for the charges being dropped." Detective Santos leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but firm. "Sarah, this pattern of behavior, the escalation, the obsession with fire as a purifying force, this didn't happen overnight." I thought about all the times our parents had covered for Jake, all the excuses they'd made, all the times they'd told me I was being too hard on him. They knew. They knew he was dangerous, and they never warned me. Families often enable destructive behavior, especially when mental illness is involved. They want to believe love and support are enough to fix someone. She paused, studying my face. But there's something else you need to know. We found evidence that he'd been planning this for months. The detective showed me photos from Jake's apartment, a studio space that looked like the headquarters of a deranged stalker. The walls were covered with pictures of Michael and me, some taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, others clearly stolen from social media. There were detailed floor plans of the Four Seasons, schedules of our vendors, even copies of our wedding invitations with notes scrawled in red ink. But the most disturbing discovery was the journal. He documented everything, Detective Santos explained, her voice carefully neutral. Every thought, every plan, every justification for what he was going to do. Would you like me to read you some excerpts? I nodded, though part of me wanted to run from that room and never look back. Entry from 6 months ago. Sarah doesn't understand that I'm protecting her. She thinks she loves him, but it's not real love. Real love doesn't corrupt. Real love doesn't steal someone away from their family. I have to save her before it's too late. My stomach turned as she continued reading. Entry from 2 months ago. Fire is the only thing that truly purifies. It burns away the lies, the corruption, the poison. When I remove him from the equation, Sarah will see clearly again. She'll understand that I was right all along. Entry from 1 week ago. The wedding is the perfect opportunity. All of his people will be there, all the corruption in one place. I can end it all at once. Sarah will hate me at first, but eventually, she'll realize I saved her life. I was crying now, huge, ugly sobs that shook my whole body. This wasn't the brother who'd teased me about boys and stolen my Halloween candy. This was a stranger who'd been wearing my brother's face, someone whose love had twisted into something monstrous and deadly. There's more, Detective Santos said quietly. He researched the building's fire suppression system, studied the exits, even practiced with accelerants. This wasn't a moment of passion, Sarah. This was a carefully planned mass murder attempt. The word murder hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking of it as an attack on Michael, a twisted attempt to break us up. But Jake hadn't just wanted to hurt my fiancé. He'd wanted to kill everyone at our wedding. My parents, my bridesmaids, Michael's family, all of our friends. In his delusional mind, murdering dozens of innocent people was an acceptable price for saving me. What happens now? I asked when I could finally speak. He's being charged with attempted murder in the first degree, arson, making terrorist threats, and assault with a deadly weapon. Given the premeditation and the number of potential victims, he's looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole. I should have felt relief, knowing that Jake would never be able to hurt anyone again. Instead, I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left only an empty shell behind. The media attention was overwhelming. Within hours of the incident, news vans were parked outside the Four Seasons, outside my parents' house, outside the hospital where Michael was being treated for second-degree burns on his arms and chest. The story had everything journalists loved: wealth, family drama, mental illness, and violence. Wedding Day Terror, the headlines screamed. Brother attempts to burn groom alive. My phone rang constantly with interview requests. Reporters camped outside my apartment building, shouting questions whenever I tried to leave. Someone leaked Jake's mugshot, and suddenly his wild-eyed, unrepentant face was on every news website and social media feed in the country. Michael's family was devastated. His mother, a sweet woman who'd welcomed me with open arms, couldn't stop crying. His father, a retired engineer who'd always been the picture of composure, looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. They'd come to Chicago expecting to celebrate their son's marriage, and instead, they'd witnessed someone try to murder him. "I'm so sorry," I kept saying to them over and over until Michael's mother finally took my hands and looked me in the eye. "This is not your fault, Sarah," she said firmly. "You couldn't have known how sick he was. None of us could have predicted this." But I felt responsible anyway. Jake was my brother, my family. I should have seen the signs, should have recognized how dangerous he'd become. Maybe if I'd been stronger, if I'd cut him out of my life completely instead of trying to manage his behavior, none of this would have happened. The worst part was my parents' reaction. Instead of horror at what Jake had done, instead of concern for Michael or gratitude that no one had died, they were focused entirely on defending their son. "He's not a monster," my mother insisted when I confronted them at the hospital. "He's sick, Sarah. He needs help, not prison." "He tried to commit mass murder," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "He could have killed dozens of people, including you and Dad." "You don't understand," my father said, his face haggard. "We've been dealing with his problems for years. The doctors said with the right medication, the right therapy." "The right therapy?" I cut him off. "You've had years to get him help, and instead, you covered for him. You enabled him. You let him get worse and worse because you were too ashamed to admit your son was dangerous." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in my life, I saw my parents clearly. Not as the loving, supportive figures I'd always believed them to be, but as two people who'd chosen to protect their image over everyone else's safety. "If you testify for his defense," I said quietly, "if you try to minimize what he did or blame his mental illness for attempted murder, I will never speak to either of you again." My mother gasped. "Sarah, you can't mean that. He's your brother. We're your family." "Family doesn't try to burn each other alive," I replied. "Family doesn't plan mass murder, and family doesn't cover up for someone who does." I walked out of that hospital room knowing I'd probably never have a normal relationship with my parents again. But for the first time in my life, I'd chosen my own well-being over keeping the peace in a family that had never really protected me anyway. The trial began 6 months later. By then, Michael and I had postponed our wedding indefinitely, both of us too traumatized to think about celebration. Michael's burns had healed, but the psychological scars ran much deeper. He'd developed PTSD, jumping at sudden noises, checking locks obsessively, avoiding crowds. The confident, successful man I'd fallen in love with had been replaced by someone who lived in constant fear. We'd both started therapy, individually and together. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, our couples therapist, helped us navigate the complex feelings of guilt, anger, and grief that threatened to destroy our relationship. Because that's what it was. Grief. I was mourning the brother I'd thought I had, the family I'd believed in, the innocence I'd lost when I realized that the people closest to you could be the most dangerous. Trauma bonds can either strengthen a relationship or destroy it, Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. The key is learning to support each other without losing yourselves in the process. Michael squeezed my hand as she spoke. Despite everything, despite the nightmares and the flashbacks and the fear, we were still together. We were still fighting for each other. The trial itself was a media circus. Jake had hired a high-profile defense attorney who argued that his mental illness made him not responsible for his actions. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about his delusional thinking, his history of untreated bipolar disorder, his genuine belief that he was protecting me. When it was my turn to testify, I walked into that courtroom with my head held high. Jake was sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his hair grown out and unkempt, his eyes still holding that wild, unfocused quality I'd seen on our wedding day. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Lisa Rodriguez, walked me through that day, step by step. I described finding Jake with the gasoline, watching him douse Michael, the moment when I realized my brother intended to commit murder. "How did you feel in that moment?" she asked. I looked directly at Jake as I answered, terrified, not just for Michael, but for everyone there. My parents, my friends, innocent people who were just trying to celebrate with us. I realized that the brother I'd grown up with, the one I'd made excuses for my entire life, was willing to kill dozens of people because he couldn't handle the fact that I was happy. Jake's attorney, during cross-examination, tried to paint me as an ungrateful sister who'd abandoned her family for money and status. He suggested that my abandonment of Jake had triggered his psychotic break, that I bore some responsibility for what had happened. I'd prepared for this with the prosecutor, but it still hurt to hear my love for Michael characterized as betrayal. To have my brother's attempted mass murder blamed on my choices. Is it your testimony that you had no idea your brother was mentally ill? The defense attorney asked. I knew he was jealous and controlling, I replied. I knew he had a pattern of sabotaging my relationships, but I never imagined he was capable of murder. My parents knew about his previous hospitalizations, his threats, his obsession with fire. They chose not to tell me. If anyone abandoned Jake, it was the people who should have made sure he got the help he needed. The defense attorney pressed on, trying to get me to admit I felt guilty, that I wished I'd done something differently. And the truth was, I did feel guilty. I would probably always wonder if I could have prevented what happened, but guilt and responsibility weren't the same thing. I loved my brother, I said finally. But love doesn't justify attempted murder. Mental illness doesn't excuse planning to kill innocent people. Jake made a choice that day, just like he'd been making choices for months while he planned this attack. He chose violence over getting help. He chose hatred over healing. And now he has to live with the consequences of those choices. When Michael testified, his voice was steady despite the obvious difficulty of reliving that day. He described the smell of gasoline, the feeling of the liquid soaking through his tuxedo, the moment when he realized Jake intended to light him on fire. I thought I was going to die, he said simply. Not just me, but everyone there. Sarah's parents, my parents, our friends. I realized this man was willing to commit mass murder because he couldn't accept that his sister was in love with someone other than him. The defense tried to argue that Jake's actions were the result of a psychotic episode, that he wasn't responsible for his behavior, but the prosecution had those journal entries, the evidence of months of planning, the clear documentation of Jake's thought processes. This wasn't a moment of madness, it was a calculated attempt at mass murder by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. My parents testified for the defense, as I'd feared they would. They painted Jake as a troubled but loving brother who'd been failed by the mental health system. They talked about his childhood, his struggles, his good qualities. They never once mentioned the people he'd tried to kill. Watching them on that witness stand, making excuses for their son while completely ignoring his victims, I felt the last of my familial bonds snap. These people who'd raised me, who'd claimed to love me, were more concerned with protecting Jake's image than with acknowledging the trauma he'd inflicted on dozens of innocent people. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts, I felt a complex mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo the damage Jake had caused, couldn't give Michael back his sense of safety, couldn't restore my faith in my family. During the sentencing phase, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. I'd written and rewritten it dozens of times, trying to find words that could adequately express the scope of what Jake had taken from us. My brother didn't just try to kill my fiancé, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. He tried to destroy everything good in my life. He wanted to murder my friends, my family, innocent people whose only crime was caring about me. He spent months planning this attack, documenting his hatred, preparing to commit mass murder, and he felt justified in doing so because he couldn't accept that I had the right to love someone he didn't approve of. I paused, looking at Jake one last time. He was staring at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. Mental illness is not a choice, but violence is. My brother chose to channel his illness into hatred instead of seeking help. He chose to plan murder instead of getting treatment. He chose to try to destroy dozens of lives instead of building his own. I hope he gets the help he needs in prison, but I also hope he serves every day of whatever sentence you give him, because the people he tried to kill deserve to know that their lives mattered more than his delusions. The judge sentenced Jake to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiff led him away in shackles, he finally looked at me, and for just a moment, I saw a flicker of the brother I'd once known. But it was too late for regret, too late for apologies, too late for anything except consequences. 6 months after the trial ended, Michael and I finally had our wedding. It was nothing like the elaborate affair we'd originally planned. Instead, we exchanged vows in Dr. Chen's office with just 2 witnesses, Michael's sister and my college roommate. There were no family members present, no big celebration, no reception. Just two people who'd survived something terrible together and were choosing to build a future anyway. "You know," Michael said as we signed the marriage certificate, "this is actually perfect. Just us, making a promise to take care of each other no matter what." I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. No drama, no stress, no family members trying to burn you alive. He laughed, and I realized it was the first time I'd heard that sound since our original wedding day. We were both different people now, more cautious, more aware of how quickly life could change, more grateful for ordinary moments of peace. But we were still us, still choosing each other, still believing that love could survive even the worst betrayal. We honeymooned in a small town in Vermont, staying at a bed and breakfast where nobody knew our story, where we could just be a newly married couple figuring out their life together. For the first time in over a year, I slept through the night without nightmares about gasoline and fire and the brother who'd tried to destroy everything I loved. On our last morning there, as we sat on the porch drinking coffee and watching the sunrise, Michael took my hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing me, I mean. Your family is gone because of me." I turned to look at him. This man who'd stood by me through the worst year of my life, who'd never once suggested that I was somehow responsible for my brother's actions, who'd chosen to marry me even after everything we'd been through. "My family was gone long before I met you," I said. "I just didn't realize it yet. They chose Jake over everyone else, including me. You didn't take my family away. You helped me see that they were never really mine to begin with." A year later, we received a letter from Jake. He'd found religion in prison, he said, and wanted to apologize for what he'd done. He claimed to understand now that his actions were wrong, that his love for me had become twisted into something destructive. I read the letter once and threw it away. Some betrayals are too deep for forgiveness. Some wounds too severe for healing. Jake had made his choices. And now I was making mine. I was choosing to build a life with people who actually loved me, not people who claimed to love me while enabling my destruction. Michael and I bought a house in a quiet suburb, far from the city where everything had happened. We adopted a dog, planted a garden, started talking about having children. I changed my last name and my phone number. I blocked my parents on social media and returned their letters unopened. It sounds harsh, maybe even cruel, but it was necessary. I'd spent 28 years trying to manage other people's dysfunction, making excuses for their behavior, sacrificing my own peace for the sake of family harmony. I was done. 3 years after the trial, on a sunny Saturday morning as I was watering our tomatoes, a car pulled up in our driveway. My heart stopped when I saw my mother get out, looking older and more fragile than I remembered. "Sarah," she said, walking toward me with tears in her eyes, "please, I just want to talk." For a moment, I felt that old familiar pull, the daughter's instinct to comfort her mother, to smooth over the conflict, to pretend everything was fine. But then I thought about Michael's scars, about the nightmares that still woke him sometimes, about the dozens of people who could have died because my parents chose enabling over intervention. "No," I said simply, "you made your choice when you testified for Jake. You chose him over everyone he tried to kill, including your own daughter. I can't have people in my life who think attempted mass murder is forgivable if the perpetrator is family." She stood there crying in our driveway for a long time, begging me to reconsider, telling me Jake was sorry, that he was getting help, that families should forgive each other. But I'd learned the difference between forgiveness and self-destruction, between love and enabling. After she left, Michael found me sitting on our back porch, staring at the garden we'd built together. "You okay?" he asked, settling beside me. "Yeah," I said, and realized I meant it. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The truth was, Jake had tried to destroy my life, but in a strange way, he'd also freed me. His attempt to burn away what he saw as corruption had actually burned away the toxic family dynamics that had controlled me for years. In trying to save me from a love he didn't understand, he'd forced me to choose between his version of family and my own happiness. I chose happiness. I chose health. I chose a life built on genuine love instead of obligation and fear, and for the first time in my life, I was truly free.
Sigh.